we would go to the park nearby, and we would, by the time we were 5, we would see benches that would say, "Dogs and Jews not allowed." And couldn't quite understand what all this was about.
When Hitler came to power in 1933, I was 2 years old. And my father, being the chairman of the Socialist Party in Cologne, which was one of the 2 parties that opposed the Nazis, the Communist Party being the other one, was accused by the Nazis of having murdered 2 Nazis.
In my mind, concentration camp, I knew it was a terrible place and we would most likely be killed there. So it was fear, terrific fear. And we started hiding.
We were told that there was basically a man in government who was an anti-Semite and who was very antagonistic towards the Jews.
We'd take the train home, and very often there were kids waiting for us, older kids, as we came out of the train station, and they started running after us 8 kids and throwing stones at us and calling us dirty Jews. So I became a very fast runner.
In 1937, a group of Nazis came to the door with a German Shepherd and wanted to see about the Jewish books. And my dad had quite a library. The dog frightened me terribly. It was a big police dog. And they took the books. There were a fair amount of Jews living in that apartment house. They took all these books, took them into the backyard of the apartment building, and there was a whole pyre that was built and basically burned all those books.
They took the German citizenship away from my mother, my father, and myself. So now we were stateless.
My dad was arrested and was arrested in the Breslau Town Hall. My mother told me that, told my brother and I that my dad was away on a trip, on a business trip. Really never divulged that he had been arrested. But cried bitterly, and we couldn't understand why she was crying.
My father was told by the Nazis that he had to get rid of all his houses. He could only take 100 marks out.
With the implementation of the Nuremberg laws and depriving all German Jews of their German citizenship, this that enabled then the government to confiscate businesses, to confiscate homes, to appropriate all their assets. It was not a physical extermination, but it was a social annihilation, because it annihilated their place in the social fabric of German society and treated them as non gratis, as foreign enemies living amongst society.
My father's family left Germany in 1939, so it was late. And in fact, my father's uncle, Walter, with whom he was very close, was actually taken by the Nazis and killed in a concentration camp. They were well-educated German Jews who believed that this was not going to affect them.
When we got this telephone call, we packed our bags, we left within an hour, and all of our furniture, everything else, pots, pans, dishes, whatever was in the kitchen, we left behind. And we never went back there.
I thought any minute they're going to stop the cars and send us off to a concentration camp.
A new law came out that German Aryans were not to go to Jewish physicians, or not be treated by Jewish physicians anymore. And then my father realized that the time is up and he should better start looking around for another country to take him.
When we boarded the ship, it was a bit exciting for me. It was sort of an adventure, and I felt somewhat secure. I had my brother there, I had my parents there. I know I was going to a new country, but it was somewhat exciting.
Quezon, like most Filipinos, was Catholic, and yet he developed an affinity for Jews because he felt that there was a sort of a symbolic brotherhood between Filipinos and Jews. That is, that as the Filipinos were the recipients of racial discrimination and bigotry on the part of many Americans at that time, that the Jews were similarly the recipients of bigotry by the Nazis. And so even though Quezon had extremely important and critical political and economic issues to wrestle with at this time, he was willing to take a stand to help the Jews.
My father applied to the Philippines, but didn't know at all where it was, what it was. All he knew was it was somewhere in the Pacific. So he looked up his encyclopedia, which was published in 1898, we found out later. And he read that this was an island discovered, or set of islands, 7,000 islands discovered by Magellan. It's under the Spanish crown. Spanish was the national language, so naturally we immediately started studying Spanish.
When we got to the Philippines and we're staying in the boarding house where there are all sorts of different people, Filipinos, mestizos, Caucasians, etc. To me, there was never any distinction. To me, they were all people. And to this day, I feel that way. But it was never a distinction to me.
And I was very impressed because we rode up Dewey Boulevard into Pasay, and it's a lovely beach, lovely beaches, beautiful banana trees, and there were the polo grounds, I remember.
One of the things we did fairly often was go to the movies, and there were half a dozen good movie theaters in the Philippines, the Lyric, the Ideal, the Gaiety Theater. I would say we probably went to the movies maybe once every couple of weeks.
The games that we played was mostly Sipa. Sipa is, it's a round metal thing with strips of paper, I believe, and you kick it with your leg. And the one who could kick it the most, of course, was the winner. When you saw how the doors were basically closed to all of us except the Philippines, and how the Filipino people are a very warm people. They're a very friendly people. We learned Filipino songs, and there were quite a few performances. Art was very important. And Filipinos have very, very good voices.
My father spoke often of his Filipino friends and recounted things that were these small moments, but clearly moments that for him were all about friendship and happiness and something that was very lighthearted.
As we were sleeping in the middle of the night, the house was shaking as if there was an earthquake. Everybody woke up. So we ran outside and stood in the street while the houses were shaking. But there were these large booms, booms, booms. Turned out that we were being bombarded by the Japanese.
We had daily air raids. They were awful. It was groups of 4, 4, and 4, which you could barely see, exceedingly well trained. And of course they bombed at random, and it was a very frightening experience.
Shortly thereafter, all of our friends that were either American, Canadian, British, or French, which were the Allies, enemies of the Japanese, were rounded up by the Japanese and interned at Santo Tomas.
The irony of this is that these refugee Jews from Germany and Austria who had passports identifying them as German Jews are not arrested by the Japanese. The Japanese don't care if they're Jewish. They have a German passport. That means that they are an ally, and they are not arrested, and they are not interned or incarcerated.
I really did not want to leave. That was my home. That was all that I knew. I was there from the time I was 7. I was there for almost 9 years. And that was my home.
For me, the Philippines, it may not be my motherland, but my adopted motherland, because if it had not been for it, I would not be the person that I am now.
Roosevelt and Churchill saved Western civilization. But Quezon, and so few people know that, President Quezon of the Philippines saved 1,200 Jewish souls, as many as Schindler, maybe even more. And that is the epitome, basically, of Judaism. It says if you save one soul, you save mankind.
I remember the Germans came.
The mob was screaming bloody murder. Kill the Jews.
We were hiding in the cellar.
They broke into the store and were looting.
We went downstairs after they left, and there was nothing left.
I still have nightmares to this day.
We apparently got a letter that said you have to leave Germany.
We were the last train out of Berlin.
Was will sein mit uns? What will happen to us?
The best hope for Jews was escape. Most of the world closed its doors. but one fledgling nation, the Philippines, did not. In this tropical paradise, thousands of miles from Europe, an unlikely group of poker players were planning a rescue. These poker players were Manuel Quezon, the country's newly elected president, Paul McNutt, U.S. High Commissioner to the Philippines, an ambitious Army colonel named Dwight Eisenhower, and 5 cigar makers from Cincinnati, the Frieder brothers. They had a plan that would save more than 1,300 Jews from Nazi death camps, a plan for a rescue in the Philippines.
How could anybody have known that it would get to be what it did? How could anybody have imagined that a whole nation would close its eyes and ears? And yet, you know what? I think it could happen anywhere again.
Beginning in 1933, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi thugs steadily transformed first Germany and then much of Europe into a living nightmare for Jews.
Then in 1935, the Nuremberg Laws came out, which stripped Jews of citizenship. All of their rights were slowly being stripped away.
Jews were no longer Germans, even if they had fought and bled for their country in previous wars.
My dad took all his medals, which had been framed, and took them outside and threw them into the pyre.
Jewish homes were invaded.
I was in the crib still, and the SS came. I guess I was taking a nap. I woke up, and my eye level was their boots, these shiny, shiny boots. I remember screaming my head off.
Nazi propaganda presented Jews as traitors, killers, monsters.
Kids came and threw stones at me and called me dirty Jew.
And worst of all, their loved ones could be taken at any moment.
Nazis came in, knocked on the door, took my father out and put him in the Dachau.
The violence peaked in November 1938 with a highly organized orgy of destruction and terror. It was called Kristallnacht because the glass from the broken windows glittered in the street like crystal.
Kristallnacht arrived and the SS group, SA men, came to our house, came through the door, went to the bathrooms and into the living room, destroyed everything.
4 of them came in with the dogs, and I was terribly frightened. I was terribly frightened that they would take my dolls.
I remember when they burned the temple.
It was ablaze and surrounded by the German fire department, which made sure that none of the non-Jewish homes were going to be burned.
I was asleep when the SS knocked on the door. And in order to get out, I went back into my room, dressed in the oldest clothes I had, took a stick, and went down the stairs into the hall where the mob was screaming bloody murder. And I took that stick and broke a few, I think it was paintings or mirrors, myself, until I got to the outside.
That night, my grandmother and I were all by ourselves, and suddenly stones crashed through our windows. Then I knew that they were after us. We were hunted.
When Kristallnacht was over, more than 100 synagogues had burned. Thousands of Jewish businesses were destroyed, and tens of thousands of Jews were forced into concentration camps, all in the passage of just one night. Diplomats held meetings, made speeches, and passed resolutions. But little, if anything, was done.
European Jewry is really ground to dust between two big millstones. One is the hateful bestiality of Nazi Germany, and the other is the apathy of the governments of the world.
In one country half a world away, an escape plan to provide refuge for Jews was already underway. 6,000 miles from Berlin, the Philippines was a country most Europeans knew only from postcards. Much like the movie Casablanca, people lived by their own rules. Motor cars shared the roads with horse-drawn caramatas. Coca-Cola coexisted with carabaos. And at the legendary Manila Hotel, the elite could sit and share a drink in air-conditioned comfort. For centuries, Manila had welcomed refugees.
It was really a fantastic mix of different peoples. Czechs, Poles, Latvians, Lebanese, Middle East, people from the Middle East, Indians. It was a mixture. And I think that was one thing that made Manila such a cosmopolitan center, because all these people coming and going, trading, staying, mixing, intermarrying.
The Philippines was once a U.S. colony, but in 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt signed a law making it a semi-independent commonwealth, promising complete independence in 10 years.
Senor Quezon, I congratulate you. Mr. President, I want to express to you the thanks.
President Manuel Quezon was determined his country would take its place among the great nations of the world. Manuel Luis Quezon was a complex person who made a deep and lasting impression on his country. Born poor, he moved into the world of wealth and power with easy bravado.
He had the total assurance, self-assurance, that he was the equal of anyone he faced. There's a Filipino concept that we call the colonial mentality, this idea that you're inferior, that you're never quite as good. He never had that problem.
He was a snappy dresser, you know, but he loved to dance and he loved to party too.
One writer said, he is full of nerve and nerves. He's one of the world's best ballroom dancers, also one of the world's supplest and hardest-boiled politicians. He loves cards and alcohol, and he loves his country. Manuel Quezon also loved the underdog.
A man like Quezon, who himself had been a prisoner, who had gotten malaria in the field, would have known what it's like to be on the run, to have no options. A man working for the freedom of his country would certainly know what it's like when someone comes knocking at your door and says, we want to be free.
Tell to contrast our peace.
While thousands marched in the United States to protest the horrors of Kristallnacht, in the Philippines, Manuel Quezon had already gone beyond protest to action, proclaiming that barring refugees was simply not right.
Other countries perhaps did not think it that important. I don't presume to say. But I know that Dad had the moral courage to do it because he believed in the sanctity of human life and the right of people to live life as they believe they should.
In 1937, a year before Kristallnacht, Japan's brutal conquest of China had reached the city of Shanghai, where refugees had already found shelter. European citizens were in danger, so the German government had sent an ocean liner to evacuate people from the battered city. The Nazis in Shanghai also evacuated any Jewish refugees who felt in danger.
The situation led to German Jews and German citizens being brought down to Manila.
When the Jewish refugees reached Manila, they were greeted by Philip Frieder, who in a matter of hours had raised thousands of dollars for their support. Ironically, it was a German consul who suggested to Frieder that it might be a good idea if he took care of the Jewish passengers. There were only a handful of Jewish families who could afford to contribute to a refugee fund, but the Frieder brothers took on the task anyway.
Number one, they were able to. They were in a position where they could talk to the right people. Number two, they saw what was happening, and they knew that somebody had to do something. So they did.
In the meantime, his brothers back in Cincinnati contacted major refugee organizations for desperately needed funds.
The Frieder brothers worked as a unit. While Uncle Alex was in the Philippines, my grandfather, Morris Frieder, was in Washington, and Philip was involved in all pieces.
Athlete, scholar, movie star, they all appreciate a fine cigar. Rich aroma, smokers.
Hungarian immigrant Samuel Frieder began an empire by selling cigars out of his New York City home before World War I. Eventually, all 5 of his sons, Philip, Henry, Alex, Morris, and Herbert, were in the business. Cigars were big. The Frieders specialized in 2-for-a-nickel cigars, and since the best of those were made from Philippine tobacco, they went right to the source.
Philip, at age maybe 32 or 34, gets on a boat, takes him 3.5 weeks to get to the Philippines, and the rest is history, because when he's there, he meets all the growers and the manufacturers, and they start buying cigars from them directly. And then they figure out that it'd probably be more advantageous to them if they could do the manufacturing.
I think when they first got to the Philippines, there were, I don't know how many Americans were there. I don't think there were 30 Jewish families there.
In less than 20 years, S. Frieder and Sons had become one of the biggest exporters of Philippine cigars, producing 250 million stogies every year. This phenomenal success was the result of hard work and strong family ties.
They were happy, family-loving, life-embracing characters. They were leaders in their community, so they seemed to slip seamlessly into being leaders in the Philippines.
Back in Cincinnati, the Frieders all lived on the same block. They took turns overseeing the business in the Philippines, and as each brother brought his family for a 2-year tour of duty in Manila, they shared the big house on Brixton Hill Road.
We had a nice yard, beautiful trees and orchids around the perimeter, swimming pool, tennis court. We belonged to a lot of clubs. It was a very gracious life.
While the children swam and played, rode ponies and had impromptu dance recitals, the adults moved within Manila's glittering social world.
My grandmother kept a booklet of entertaining that she would do regularly, and there is an entry from September of 1939. And the people attending this dinner party at my grandparents' home in Manila were General and Mrs. MacArthur, Colonel and Mrs. Eisenhower, and the acting High Commissioner.
In fact, evenings were just an extension of the working day. In Manila, having fun was a serious business. The Frieders had developed a close relationship with President Quezon over the years. They met when Quezon was in the Philippine Senate, and they were young men building a business. The relationship deepened as the cigar business grew, and Quezon rose through the political ranks. In 1937, Paul V. McNutt was appointed U.S. High Commissioner for the Philippines and joined this circle of powerful friends. The former governor of Indiana, McNutt made no secret that he was aiming for the White House in 1940, which probably accounts for why President Roosevelt banished him to Manila. But for McNutt, Moral conviction trumped political ambition. Urged by Jewish allies back home, he championed European Jews despite anti-Semitism among American voters.
He understood very well intolerance in American life and intolerance in American politics.
In their drive towards independence, the Filipinos had elected a Congress and inaugurated a president. But a separate Philippine immigration law had not yet been written. And in this legal vacuum, Paul McNutt realized that approving visas was one of the very few powers still held by the U.S. High Commissioner. And a visa was a powerful document that meant a Jewish family could escape from Nazi persecution. Despite all the smiles at his swearing in, McNutt's relationship with Kazan was complicated until they discovered a mutual passion: poker. McNutt loved poker so much that he even had monogrammed mother-of-pearl poker chips.
There was one time when McNutt lost to him. When McNutt was trying to pay him, he said, "Don't pay me. Consider that my contribution to your candidacy."
The games went long into the night. The Frieders were regulars at the table, and so was Colonel Dwight Eisenhower, the well-liked chief of staff for General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had been tasked to build a Filipino military strong enough to deter the looming Japanese threat.
Eisenhower was a fantastic card player. He managed to pay for all of his expenses at West Point with his poker earnings, and he went on actually to give probably my grandmother her finest birthday presents based on his card-playing earnings.
Americans like MacArthur or Eisenhower, they mingled freely and as equals with Filipinos, and the Filipinos deeply appreciated it.
President Kazan especially appreciated Eisenhower's talents.
Eisenhower was at one point writing speeches for my grandfather and was even given an office in the executive building in the presidential palace.
His analytical mind went far beyond cards. The Frieders in particular valued his ability to organize even the largest task.
Eisenhower clearly knew about the impending plans for the rescue. I think there's no doubt about it. My father was told by my grandfather that these plans were underway and had told his son John, my father, that in fact he had been asked to play a role in this.
These friends who ultimately offered him a job making $60,000 a year, which is about $1 million in 2011 money, to assist in the planning for finding homes for these Jewish refugees leaving Germany. And it makes perfect sense to take a problem such as this to a man like Eisenhower, who had the ability to plan on a large scale, to be able to take thousands or thousands and thousands of moving parts and try to orient them and to push in the right direction.
The card games were held in many places, on the presidential yacht.
My father played poker with him on his yacht just outside Malacañang Palace, where his yacht was moored in the Pasig River.
In the air-conditioned lobby of the Manila Hotel.
The Manila Hotel was the tops. It was a major center of social activity.
At the home of Greek-American private investigator Angel Zervoulakos.
This kind of poker where the Frieder brothers come to, they come out looking like they've smoked a lot of cigars. They sure smell like it, though. I do believe that my dad had a part in this, that helping the Frieder brothers, and he knew what they were doing.
These high-stake games also took place in the cooling breeze of the Frieders' back porch.
We could hear what was going on the porch all the time. We could hear when someone brought food out to them or drinks out to them, but they were playing poker out there.
It was at these games that the friends developed a plan to build upon the success of the Shanghai rescue. It was a cause close to all of them. McNutt called Jewish refugees helpless and persecuted wanderers with no place to lay their heads. Eisenhower wrote in his diary, "Hitler's record with the Jews is as black as that of any barbarian of the Dark Ages." To Kazan, it was not a question of whether his country would help, but why other nations did not. For the Frieders, it simply needed to be done.
They felt, because they were one of the 50 American Jewish families there, that that was the role everybody had to play if you're lucky enough to be in the Philippines. Try and get as many out as you could.
The goal was to bring thousands of European Jews to the Philippines. But even with the legal authority to approve visas, Paul McNutt knew he needed to be holding a pair of pocket aces to deal with an unsympathetic State Department. One was support from President Kazan. Kazan had dealt with waves of immigrants before, and he was acutely aware of the voices of anti-Semitism in his own country. But Kazan stood strong. Even with Kazan's support, McNutt knew their plan could still be torpedoed because of the requirement that no immigrant could become a public charge. In other words, no money, no job, no visa.
President Kazan had stipulated that he didn't want anybody that would be a burden on the economy. And so the Jewish community had to promise that they would take care of them, which they did.
And that was McNutt's second ace, the Frieders. Kazan and McNutt turned to the Frieder brothers to work out a system so that only Jewish immigrants with the skills and resources to support themselves would be sent visas. And if the refugees did arrive penniless, the Jewish community would still take care of them. And so it began. The Jewish community prepared a list of occupations where they thought a refugee could get a job in the Philippines. A list that could mean life or death for a European Jew.
They had to pick and choose people to let in, and there were so many more that wanted to come than they could fill jobs for, that they could support with the money that they had. And so that's a heartbreaking job. I mean, to be doing the right thing and then to have to say no to people because you don't have enough money or you don't have this. That was tough.
When I came home from school at noontime, we were supposed to pick up my father and come home for lunch. But he was never ready because he was working on the lists. He enlisted the Jewish community in helping them get jobs. And he hired a lot of people in the factory himself. It was all-consuming.
That's when the ad came out in the main Jewish paper in Berlin, and it said that there's a place in the Philippines for people who have special skills.
In a world where options were fast disappearing, there were finally answers to the desperate pleas that arrived every day. The Frieders and others on the Refugee Committee chose who would be approved for a visa. These lists were then sent to Kazan for review, and McNutt passed them to the State Department and U.S. embassies in Europe.
The United States is crossed out, and it's written Philippine Islands only.
Now, plans could be made.
They melted down money. They made a bracelet. Each of my mother and my aunt, her sister, and my grandmother had bracelets made and necklaces made out of gold. And that's how they were able to get stuff out.
Disasters averted. For young Marta Miodowski, an Aryan girl married to a Jewish cigar maker, a Philippine visa was the key that released her husband from the infamous Sachsenhausen concentration camp.
She got a taxi. Those camps were, of course, in the woods, and they had sentries. When he got to the second sentry, he said he wasn't going further, but my mother you didn't say no to. When she got there, she told them she had come to see the commandant.
I had blonde hair. I looked like a real German, what they called a real German girl.
She was an attractive woman, and they probably figured, oh, okay, he's got a little visitor. She told them she was coming to get her husband.
Nobody questioned me that, that he was a Jewish guy.
They had, I guess you call it roll call, and they were all lined up, and when they called his number, my dad wasn't going to move. He figured that was it. So she pointed him out, and took him back in the cab. He had thick, black, wavy hair, and shaved his head, naturally, in the concentration camp. And when Mom brought him, and I took one look at him, and I ran away, and my father was real upset. But what I did is I came back with a hat, and I covered him up.
I could have stayed. They were offered it to me. They would announce my marriage. I said, I have a daughter. And I asked him, I said, what is going to happen to her? He said, for him to take a guess, she's probably going to end up in a concentration camp. And I said, no, thank you. We will leave. All of us, together.
Even with a visa, it was a terrifying and dangerous journey to freedom.
The border police wouldn't let us in. And so they took us out of the train and returned us to France and we went through the tunnel. There's a giant tunnel between France and Italy. And we went back and forth through that a number of times. The French in turn said, your visa expired. So bang, they put us back to go to Italy. In the meantime, our boat was leaving, and my father was desperate. He finally bribed somebody to get us an escort to the boat.
And on the border of Italy and Germany, the Nazis came on board the train, looked at the passports, and took one look at me, who was blonde, blue-eyed. He says, this child is not a Jew. He is a typical Aryan. We're taking him off the train. And my parents were fortunately enough to convince them that I was their child.
But many other families were torn apart.
My grandparents came, I never forget this, I still see my grandmother, to the train, and the goodbye was awful. Because my grandparents knew they may never see us again. And so it was a very, very emotional and caring goodbye.
Kay sarap mabuhay sa sariling bayan kung walang alipin at may kalayaan. Ang bayang sinisiil bukas ay babangon din. Ang silang ay pupula sa timyas ng paglaya. Ang bayan kong Pilipinas, lupain ng ginto't bulaklak, pag-ibig ay sa kanya. nag-alay ng ganda at dilag, at sa kanyang yumi at ganda, dayuhan ay nahalina. Bayan ko, binihag ka, nasadlak sa dusa. Ibon mang may layang lumipad, kulungin mo at umiiyak. Bayan pa kayang sagdal dilag, ang di magnasang makaalpas. Pilipinas kong minumutya, hugad ng luha at dalita, aking at hika, makita kang sagdal. Laya Pilipinas kong minumutya, hugad ng